Her small, desperate hand latched onto the expensive fabric of the suit sleeve, her tiny fingers clutching the material like a lifeline. Tears poured down her face, mixing with grime, as she pointed across the lavish room. "They're beating my mum! She's dying!" The deep murmur of the exclusive restaurant, the black onyx, instantly died. Cutlery stopped. Expensive crystal glasses remained mid-clink. Every eye in the crowded room, filled with powerful men in bespoke suits, snapped toward the disturbance. But the man she had run to, the man whose sleeve she clutched, was no ordinary patron. He was Arnord, the city's reigning mafia boss. His face, a canvas of terrifying dark ink, was famed for its lack of expression, and tonight was no different. He sat at his corner table, his posture radiating lethal calm, the heavily tattooed surface of his neck and face drawing attention away from the high-stakes meeting he was conducting. This was Arnord's territory, where silence was law. And now, a 7-year-old girl named Pearl had shattered it. What this cold, feared enforcer of the criminal underworld did next would leave a mark on every witness that night. It was a chilly evening, and Arnord was presiding over his weekly war council. Territory, debts, and life-and-death problems were being addressed with surgical, cold detachment. Sentiment was weakness, until Pearl's plea forced him to choose between the empire he built on fear and the small, trembling life clinging to his arm. The words the little girl, Pearl, had cried out were not a threat, not a debt, not a business proposition, the things Arnord understood. They were a plea, pure and unqualified, shattering the meticulously constructed wall he had spent 2 decades building around his heart. He looked down at the tiny girl, still clinging to his sleeve, her tears soaking the expensive Italian wool. Her small body trembled with exhaustion and terror. He saw the red, raw panic in her eyes, and suddenly, the opulent, hushed room of the black onyx dissolved around him. He was back in the dirt and shadow of the tenements. He was just a boy, small and insignificant, walking into his cramped apartment. He remembered the sickening, wet sound of a dull impact that had abruptly ceased, leaving a terrible, ringing silence. He remembered the smell of cheap kerosene and blood. He found his older sister, not beaten by thugs, but broken by a crushing debt. The loan shark had visited. The law of the street, the law Arnord would eventually master and enforce, had already taken his most cherished person. He remembered the paralyzing cold of that moment, the realization that purity and love were currency for pain, and that weakness guaranteed destruction. That day, he hadn't just lost his sister. He had deliberately killed the vulnerable boy he was, burying every spark of empathy beneath layers of cold muscle and calculated rage. The heavily tattooed skin, the deep, rumbling voice, the absolute, terrifying control. It was all armor built over that single, fatal wound. For years, that memory had been a dark, protective ice shelf, keeping the pain locked away. No human concern had ever broken it, but Pearl's tears, her raw, desperate courage to seek out the most feared man in the city, struck a nerve he believed had been severed permanently. This wasn't the quiet surrender of the weak. This was an act of magnificent, impossible strength, a tiny, innocent figure demanding justice from the heart of the beast. She didn't seek mercy. She sought accountability from the only source she recognized as powerful enough to deliver it. Arnord had sworn to the world he would never be weak again. Looking at Pearl, he realized his revenge was not against the world, but against the people who hurt the helpless. He slowly moved his massive hand, covered in dark, tribal markings, and rested it over Pearl's small, pale fingers. The gesture was tentative, foreign. He leaned closer, ignoring the whispers and the fearful stares of the other patrons, lowering his voice until it was a low, comforting vibration. Before we see what happens when Arnord decides to draw blood, make sure you hit the subscribe button, ring that bell, and get ready for a story you won't soon forget. Arnord didn't need to ask his lieutenants to clear the room. The sheer tension caused every man to retreat a respectful distance. He gave Pearl a moment to compose herself, rubbing her back with the gentlest motion his massive, scarred hand could manage. "What is your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the ringing silence. "P. Pearl," she managed, her breath hitching. "Pearl," Arnord repeated, looking into her wide, innocent eyes. "My name is Arnord. Can you tell Arnord what happened to your mother?" Pearl's voice was a fragile, broken thing, but as Arnord focused on her, the terror receded, replaced by the deep necessity of being heard. She described the men, 2 of them. One was skinny, with teeth that looked like piano keys, and he kept demanding money from the laundromat. The other was the scary one. He had a snake on his arm, she whispered, her eyes widening again at the memory. A green one, wrapped around a knife. Arnold's gaze sharpened into the deadliest precision. The green snake wrapped around a knife, the sign of the green fangs. A vicious, small-time operation specializing in extorting local businesses near the industrial sector. Arnold hadn't bothered with the green fangs. They were mosquitoes. But mosquitoes that had just drawn blood in his city? And where did they go? Arnold pressed, his tone calm, unwavering. They just ran. Down the alley, she pointed vaguely toward the south of the restaurant. Mum is still on the floor, behind the washers. She clung to him then, shaking violently. Please, Arnold, please. He nodded. A silent promise made between the towering brute and the tiny child. He gently pushed a button beneath his table. Within seconds, his chief enforcer, Roman, a man whose patience was famously non-existent, was at his side. Arnold spoke directly to Roman, his voice now switching from velvet rumble to chilled steel. Find the green fangs. 2 men. One skinny, one with a green snake tattoo on his forearm. They are currently near the dock alley, probably still celebrating. Roman's eyes, dark and intelligent, absorbed the information instantly. I want them brought to the old slaughterhouse, alive. Do not soil your hands with them. Next, Arnold pulled out his phone, a secure satellite link. He dialed Dr. Chen, the city's most accomplished and most discreet trauma surgeon, currently relaxing at home. Chen, I have a priority case. Laundromat, industrial sector. She has blunt force trauma, critical condition. I want you there with a full team in 10 minutes. No police, no ambulance. You move her to the sub-level OR at the tower. Her survival is non-negotiable. He hung up before Chen could register a complaint. He looked back at Pearl, whose tears had momentarily stopped, replaced by fearful exhaustion. He stood up slowly, lifting her with him. His movements were calculated, gentle enough not to jar her, yet powerful enough to dismiss the silent, terrified assembly in the room. Come, Pearl, Arnold said, placing her carefully on his hip. We are going to find your mother, and then Arnold is going to take care of those men. The absolute certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. The men in the black onyx looked away, pale, knowing that they had just witnessed not an act of charity, but the ignition of a storm. Arnold carried Pearl, cradled against his broad, tattooed chest, out of the frozen opulence of the black onyx and into the waiting black motorcade. The transition was instant and brutal. His driver, Leo, broke every city speed limit, lights flashing silently through the night, the powerful engine roaring a promise of swift retribution. Pearl, exhausted by her fear, had slumped against him, her small head resting beneath his jaw. The weight of her trust was heavier than any load of gold he'd ever moved. The car screeched to a halt outside a dilapidated strip of shops near the docks, a place where the city lights bled out into oppressive shadow. The front window of the small, brightly named laundromat, Clean and Press, was a chaotic mess of shattered glass and splintered wood. Inside, the air was cold and thick with the metallic tang of blood. Arnold placed Pearl gently behind a thick support pillar, his body a shield between her and the horrific scene. Stay right here, baby girl. Don't look. He stepped into the shop. A woman lay crumpled behind the counter, her clothes torn, her face a pale, bruised mask. Dr. Chen, the nervous surgeon Arnold had called, was already kneeling over her, having arrived with impossible speed. Chen's face was grim as he worked with a full trauma kit, his hands moving with the efficiency of a specialist. Boss, she's losing blood fast, Chen reported, his eyes wide with urgency. Blunt force trauma, internal bleeding suspected. We need a clean transfer to the surgical suite now. Arnold didn't speak. He simply stood over the scene, his jaw working as he took in the petty destruction, the violence inflicted over what couldn't be more than a few dollars. He glanced back at Pearl, whose small whimpering sounds were muffled by the pillar. The ice that had cracked earlier now turned to a churning volcanic rage. He knelt, not to the mother, but to the doctor. Take her. Get her through this, Arnold commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp. He pressed a keycard into Chen's hand, access to the hidden, state-of-the-art medical floor beneath his main headquarters. Her life is priority number 1. Nothing else matters. Go. As the doctor's team efficiently strapped the mother onto a gurney and moved her out into the night, Arnold turned, his shadow swallowing the remaining light in the shattered shop. He picked up a small, red scarf, the mother's, dropped near a pool of drying blood. His eyes, fixed on the docklands where Pearl said the thugs operated, were no longer cold. They were incandescent with murderous intent. Arnord drove in silence, Pearl still nestled against him, the crimson scarf clutched in his fist. They bypassed the standard hospital network and headed straight for Arnord's main tower, a monolithic structure that pierced the city's skyline. Deep beneath the executive floors lay the facility's secret medical wing, a stark white sanctuary of healing, built years ago to quietly patch up his own men without involving outside institutions. He took Pearl directly to the private recovery suite adjoining the surgical theater. It wasn't the sterile white of a hospital room, but a space furnished with deep, comforting blues and thick, sound-dampening velvet. It was luxury designed for quiet convalescence, a safe harbor from the storm. He lowered the girl gently onto a massive chaise lounge. She was barely conscious, her small frame utterly depleted. A female nurse named Clara, a woman with the calm, steady presence of a mountain, was already waiting. Clara immediately moved to offer Pearl a small cup of water and a soft, fleece blanket. "Where is she?" Pearl whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes struggling to focus past the exhaustion. "Is she going to die?" Arnord knelt down, his massive, tattooed frame awkward but deliberate, bringing his face level with hers. The intense lights of the suite did nothing to diminish the fear in her eyes, but she didn't look away from him. "Listen to me, Pearl," he said, his voice a deep, rough rumble, stripped of any hint of command, speaking only with the gravity of a vow. "Your mother is right now with Dr. Chen. He is the best doctor, and he works only for me. I gave him my word, and my word is absolute. She will be taken care of. She is safe here. You are safe here." He reached out and gently smoothed her hair back from her forehead. The gesture was so foreign, so deeply suppressed, that the muscles in his face seemed to ache from the effort. He showed her the keycard to the suite. "This is a fortress. No one who wishes you harm can get in. You rest. Clara will stay with you." Pearl's hand, still clutching his, tightened slightly. "Will you come back?" "I must go keep the rest of my promise," Arnord stated, his eyes dark and absolute. He let the scarf fall gently onto the side table. "I promised you justice. Now I go to settle the debt these men owe you, and what they owe your mother." He waited until her breathing deepened into the deep, rhythmic pattern of exhausted sleep. Only when he was certain she was safe, physically separated from the world by steel and concrete and his personal guard, did Arnord rise. He gave Clara a curt nod, his face now a mask of cold resolve. Stepping out into the clinical hallway, he signaled to Tony and Roman, who were waiting with tense, expectant patience. The tenderness he'd shown Pearl was instantly discarded, replaced by the predator's focus. "The mother is under the knife. The girl is sleeping," Arnord confirmed, his voice low and dangerous. He flexed his large, tattooed hand, the same hand that had just stroked a child's forehead. "It is time for the Green Fangs to learn the difference between extortion and drawing the attention of the city's true law." Arnord's black SUV, driven by Leo, tore away from the tower, heading back toward the docklands. Roman and Tony followed in a separate armored vehicle, their mood grimly efficient. Roman had already made the calls, shaking the lowest branches of the Green Fang's pathetic little operation. It didn't take finesse, it took fear. Within minutes, they had a location. A greasy, neon-lit dive bar known as the Drowned Rat, barely 3 blocks from the scene of the crime. The bar's lights, a buzzing purple and sickly yellow, promised ruin and fleeting, toxic pleasure. Inside the Drowned Rat, the stench of stale beer and cheap adrenaline was heavy. The 2 thugs, Viper, the skinny one with the piano key teeth, and Draco, the hulking one with the green snake tattoo wrapped around a crude knife on his forearm, were huddled in a corner booth, laughing loud enough to cut through the distorted music. Draco was slamming back shots, his face flushed with the temporary high of violence. "I told the old hag," Viper snickered, picking at a chipped tooth with a filthy nail. "Don't mess with the Fang's tax, or you get the boot. Didn't even need to ask the boss." "Shoulda seen her face," Draco growled, pleased with himself. He took another shot, oblivious to the fact that the entire bar had suddenly gone silent, focusing on the large, immovable shadow that had just fallen across the doorway. Viper and Draco, too drunk and high on their recent brutality, didn't look up until Roman's shadow completely obscured their booth. Draco finally lifted his head, his eyes struggling to focus on the impossible figure standing over them. He only saw the dark, the furious face of the most powerful man in the city, a man he, a mosquito, had just insulted with an act of petty cruelty. The capture was swift and horrifically efficient. Arnord spoke only 2 words: the scarf. Roman moved first, slamming Draco's head against the wall before the thug could even twitch for the cheap piece he carried. Tony grabbed Viper, twisting his arm back with a sickening snap that cut off his terrified squeal. They were lifted like sacks of refuse, dragged through the stunned crowd, and thrown into the back of the waiting van. No one in the drowned rat dared to call the police or even look away until the engine sound faded. Arnord, his face a mask of stone, walked slowly past the booth, his eyes sweeping over the half-finished drinks and the spilled chips, the paltry spoils of their violence. He paused, picked up the empty glass Draco had just used, crushed it slowly in his tattooed hand, and dropped the shimmering fragments onto the seat. He climbed into the passenger seat of his SUV. Leo immediately pulled away. "The slaughterhouse, Leo," Arnord instructed, his voice low, almost contemplative. The voice of a man planning a difficult chess move. "I want them waiting. And Roman, tell the guards to prepare the heavy chain." The rage was no longer incandescent. It was focused, distilled, and far more dangerous. He looked down at the hand that had just crushed glass, remembering the terrifying fragility of Pearl's fingers clinging to his sleeve. The men had violated his city's unspoken rule. Do not touch the truly innocent. Arnord's system of violence was structured. It had rules. They had broken them. And now, the system was coming for them. He wasn't just Arnord the boss going to deliver punishment. He was Arnord the judge, delivering the absolute justice he wished he had received long ago. The old slaughterhouse was where the city's darkness was processed. A sprawling, derelict industrial space near the marsh. It reeked of stale blood and chemical cleaners, the perfect backdrop for the kind of justice that never made the news. Arnord stepped out of the black SUV, his massive silhouette framed by the single, weak lamp above the rusting loading dock. Inside, the vast space was illuminated by a single powerful spotlight aimed at the center of the concrete floor. Viper and Draco were already there, stripped to their undershirts, chained separately to massive meat hooks anchored to the wall, their feet barely scraping the floor. They were sobbing, the alcohol and adrenaline worn off, leaving only pure, gut-wrenching terror. Arnord walked toward them, his heavy boots echoing in the cavernous room. He stopped directly in front of Draco, the one with the green snake tattoo. Roman and Tony stood like silent, expectant statues flanking him. "You took a woman," Arnord began, his voice surprisingly quiet, almost conversational, yet vibrating with an intensity that made Draco's chains rattle. "A poor woman, running a laundromat, a business where people come to make their lives clean. And you chose to make her bleed," Draco stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "Boss, we didn't know it was yours. The tax. We were just collecting the tax for the Green Fangs." "Tax," Arnord repeated, the word a soft sneer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small red scarf, letting it dangle. "Is this worth the tax? Draco? This piece of cloth? This is what you left her with. You beat her for a few dollars." He raised his voice slightly, the sound amplifying into a terrible, cutting roar that bounced off the steel roof. "You violated the sanctity of the market. You don't hit the weak. You don't touch the children. Your tax wasn't payment. It was cruelty. My system has rules, Draco. You just committed an act of war against the only true law this city knows." Arnord took a slow, deliberate step back. His eyes, fixed on Draco, were terrifying in their lack of emotion. "Who gave you permission to operate in that district? Who is your boss?" Viper, seeing his chance, shrieked. "It's the Serpent, the leader of the Fangs. He's running the whole thing out of the old shipyard." Arnord didn't even glance at Viper. He kept his attention on Draco, who was sweating profusely. "Your friend just named his master Draco. You had one chance to live a simpler life. Now, you have one chance to tell me why you needed to inflict that specific unnecessary damage on a mother. You enjoyed the sound of her bones breaking, didn't you?" Draco's face crumbled into raw fear. He knew the truth was irrelevant. Only Arnord's rage mattered. Arnord nodded slowly, accepting the silence as a confession. He turned to Roman. "Cut the tattoo off the first one," he instructed, his voice flat. "Then break the hands of the second. Non-lethal. I want them to remember what they did every time they try to light a cigarette or swing a cheap knife again. When you're done, deliver them both, with proof of their failure to the Serpent at the shipyard. Tell him Arnord has collected his debt." Arnord didn't wait to hear the sickening sounds that followed. He simply walked toward the exit, the metallic scent of the slaughterhouse clinging to him like a second skin. Justice, he knew, wasn't supposed to be pretty. It was simply supposed to be absolute, and for Pearl, it was only just beginning. The shipyard was a kingdom built on rust and secrecy, a maze of shipping containers stacked like colossal, forgotten Lego bricks. At the heart of it, in a repurposed freight office overlooking the dark water, was the Serpent, leader of the Green Fangs. He wasn't as large as Arnold, but his slim build and perpetually twitching smile suggested a predatory intelligence far sharper than his low-level thugs. The Serpent, whose real name was Silas, was enjoying a game of poker with his lieutenants when the heavy steel door was flung open. 2 heavy sacks of bodies were dumped unceremoniously onto the stained carpet. Silas's smile vanished as he saw his 2 men, Viper and Draco, barely conscious, leaking blood, one missing a significant chunk of skin, the other cradling 2 useless, broken hands. Roman stepped forward, holding the red scarf. His face, usually impassive, was alight with cold contempt, a gift from Arnold, payment for a mistake. Before Silas could react, the entire room went cold. Arnold filled the doorway, his immense frame blocking the last vestiges of light. He wasn't flanked by many men, only Tony and Leo, but his presence carried the weight of 1,000 armed enforcers. The poker game evaporated, chips scattered across the table. Silas's men froze, their hands hovering inches from their weapons. Arnold didn't look at Silas's men. He didn't even look at the Serpent directly, fixing his gaze instead on the scarred tabletop between them, as if Silas were beneath his consideration. Silas. Arnold's voice finally came, a low, resonating drone in the small office. You have crossed a line that does not exist for me. You allowed your insects to abuse a civilian, a woman, trying to keep her child safe. A child who came to my table, looking for a law you proved incapable of respecting. Silas, recovering his composure with a visible effort, leaned forward, a desperate bravado flickering in his eyes. Arnold, with respect, this is a minor territorial dispute, a misunderstanding. The boys were drunk. Silence. The command was sharp and absolute, cutting off Silas mid-word like a blade through thread. Arnold finally lifted his eyes, and Silas flinched from the sheer, icy fire in them. There is no misunderstanding, Arnold continued, folding his arms across his vast chest. There are rules. My rules. Rule number 1. The women and children in my city are off limits. They are neutral territory. If you cannot extract money without inflicting permanent, unnecessary damage on the weak, then you have no business here. You are not a collector, Silas. You are an animal. Arnold laid out his terms, cold and precise, like stones marking a grave. The Green Fangs are finished in the industrial sector, effective immediately. You will withdraw every man, every marker, every dime. You will dissolve your operation and move to the East Districts, near the scrapyards. You will never set foot in the docks, the lower market, or the factory line again. Silas stood up, his voice trembling with forced defiance. You can't do that. We have influence. We have connections to the... Arnold slammed his hand flat on the table, the impact rattling the entire freight office and scattering the remaining chips. Your influence just got 2 of your men permanently disabled and delivered back to you in a sack. Do you think I care about your connections? I am the connection. I am the law. He leaned in, his voice dropping again to a terrifying whisper. The woman is in my private hospital. Her medical costs are now yours, every penny. I want the money for her treatment, all future costs plus 100,000 credits in compensation for her suffering. On my desk by noon tomorrow. If you miss that deadline, I will not come for your men, Silas. I will come for you. And trust me, I am much less merciful than Roman. Arnold straightened, dismissing the Serpent with a final chilling glance. You have until noon. I do not forget promises, Silas. Do not force me to remind you what happens when you touch the innocent. He turned and strode out, his 2 enforcers following. The silence he left behind was thick with dread. Silas and his remaining men stood utterly still, staring at the broken bodies on the floor and the vast empty space Arnold's departure had created. They knew, instantly, that the power structure of the city had shifted, all because of one small, terrified girl who had sought protection from the only man capable of giving it. Arnold had drawn his moral line in blood, and every gang leader in the city would soon learn where that line lay. The violence is over, but the story of how Arnold changes is just beginning. If you're invested in seeing this monster find peace, secure your spot in the narrative right now by hitting subscribe and becoming a part of the channel. 6 months drifted by, not in the blur of violence and debt Arnold was used to, but in the steady, quiet rhythm of healing. The city, having witnessed the spectacular, brutal demise of the Green Fangs, treated the industrial sector with a new, respectful, wide berth. The message was clear. Arnold had drawn a line, and crossing it meant absolute ruin. The laundromat, clean and press, had been painstakingly rebuilt. The shattered glass was gone, replaced by thick, clean panes, and the broken machinery had been swapped out for the newest, quietest models. It was brighter now, smelling not of kerosene and blood, but of hot water and fresh linen. Arnold maintained his distance, yet his presence was constant. He arrived on the last Tuesday of every month, never in the roaring motorcade, but in a simple, unmarked black sedan. He would dismiss Leo a block away and walk, an immense, out-of-place shadow, moving through the residential quiet. He came not as the king of the city, but as a silent caretaker of a single, small patch of earth he had claimed as sacred. Pearl's mother, Maria, was back behind the counter. Her scars were fading, and the haunted look in her eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet strength. She still flinched at loud noises, but when she saw Arnold, her posture shifted from apprehension to a grudging, deep gratitude. They exchanged few words. Arnold would hand her a manila envelope cash for the rent, the utilities, the best health insurance money could buy, and Maria would simply nod, her dignity intact. They both understood that this was not a charity, but an eternal, silent debt paid to a child's courage. The true purpose of the visit was Pearl. He would find her in the back, drawing diligently on a small table he'd personally had installed. She was no longer the trembling, hollow-eyed figure he'd first encountered. Her laughter was a bright, bell-like sound that had no place in Arnold's world, yet it somehow centered him. On this particular Tuesday, Arnold watched her for a moment from the threshold. Pearl, now 7, looked up from her sketchbook, her hair tied back with the red scarf Arnold had retrieved that terrible night. "Arnold!" she exclaimed, her voice unburdened, running toward him without a hint of fear. He knelt immediately, not to make himself small, but to meet her on her level. This was the only place in the world he knelt. He accepted her fierce, tiny embrace, the sensation of her small arms around his neck feeling profoundly foreign and yet entirely necessary. "What are you drawing today, Pearl?" he asked, his voice still low, but lacking the rumble of threat, sounding almost hesitant. "It's you," she announced proudly, pulling him back to the table. The drawing was an abstract masterpiece, a towering dark stick figure with enormous blocky arms, surrounded by tiny broken green snake figures. But the figure's face was not the mask of stone he usually wore. It was drawn with a wide, childish smile. He looked at the image, then back at the reality. He felt the familiar, cold pressure on his chest. But this time, it was not the lock of the armor. It was the movement of the broken ice, melting, revealing the old wound beneath. "You should always draw," he murmured, gently touching the paper. "It's important to remember what's beautiful. This story is a powerful reminder that even the hardest hearts can find a reason to change." If this message resonated with you, show your support by liking the video and joining our family of subscribers. Pearl didn't understand the depth of his words, but she understood the warmth in his touch. She simply smiled, a full, uninhibited, radiant burst of light that reached her clear, hopeful eyes. It was a smile Arnold realized he had spent his entire adult life trying to destroy in himself and had just found saved in another. He stood up, towering over the colorful, bright laundromat. The debt was settled, the enemy scattered, but his mission was not over. Looking at Pearl, he knew the law he upheld now was not one of territory or profit, but of protection. The wall was broken, and in its place, a new, vital purpose bloomed, guarding this single, perfect, terrible piece of rediscovered light. His redemption was not loud, and it wasn't complete, but in the pure, trusting gaze of a little girl, Arnold had finally found a reason to wear his armor for someone other than himself. Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already, so click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.